just recognizing we're all coming to this space carrying so many different things, and wanted to invite us to do a practice that a friend of mine had done at a space during Lent for just rest, which is, I wanted you to we'll pause for a moment and just, oh, excuse me. And then either, what I would invite you to do is to write in the chat one word describing how you're doing. What are you feeling? What are you bringing in tonight? So I'm just going to pause. I'll say a word of gathering prayer, and then invite you to share that. And then we'll just actually take some time. Want to open us up with then a scripture passage, and then we'll take some time for just some silent prayer together, and then some just space to name as we then come into this conversation. So let us begin this space, welcoming God's presence, who is in our midst and in us. God of all life, this night we come together, and we come carrying so many different things. God, in this night, we pray that you would be with our city, that you, God, would breathe. God, that you would meet us and our whole world in the places of need. God, that you would be close to the family, the mother and child and girlfriend of Duante, right? God, we pray that you would be close to, and as you are the God who is for all of us, God, that you would be close to Black, brown, and people of color in our country. God, that you would be close to those this night who are officers throughout the city. God, that your vision and your sense of what justice and shalom, God, that you would continue to break forth in ways that we can't even see right now. So however we come this night, God, might you meet us in this space, God, that we might be transformed and challenged and encouraged and empowered for how we might show up as your people, listening to the cries of your people, cries longing for justice and freedom. So God, now in this space, first through some silent prayer and reflection, we bring ourselves. And then after that, invite you at any point to just put a word in the comments, friends, how you're coming into this space tonight. God, hear us now as we bring ourselves in our prayers to you. God, we know that even from the first time where human interaction led to violence and the killing of one brother by another, that you have named that even the ground cries out. And so God, hear us now in our prayers. Hear the prayers and the cries of all of your children this night. And even where there is silence and grief too deep for language, May your spirit intercede. God, indeed, we long for your kingdom. Give us wisdom for how to participate in it. In your name we gather. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Sarah,
Mm-hmm.
when you put a note in chat, how do you send it?
Oh, just hit enter. Great question.
I don't see enter.
On your computer, just
Yeah.
hit the return button.
Oh, thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just, I'm going to read through the words that you shared. Incredulous, despairing, numb, protective, deep grief, angry, exhausted, sad, hopeless, angry, raw, deep, overwhelming sadness, heavy, frustration, discouragement, mentally exhausted. Thank you for naming and thanks for being here tonight. James Baldwin's work, unfortunately, remains prophetic and powerful and incisive. And honestly, I'm grateful tonight we get to talk about him and his work. And thank you for being here. And as we do that, and so Christian, I'm gonna turn it over to you to bring us into that space and just to share a little bit about Baldwin, and then we'll have some conversation, and we're not expecting tonight, like you don't have to stay on topic of here's all the pieces of the plot line. I mean, right, we're making connections, we're wrestling together to think about our world and how this impacts our lives and the moments in which we're living now, even as we're engaging with Baldwin's work. So Christian, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll hold space for us all to be able to wrestle and converse one with another.
All right. Well, it's great to be able to gather together, and yeah, it's just hard to believe. I guess it's not on a certain level hard to believe, and yet on another level, it is hard to believe that this has happened again, and we think about some of the themes I hope that you experienced when you were watching either both of the movies or one of the movies. I was kind of imagining tonight really as having the real forum feel. I don't really have like a presentation necessarily to offer to you, and we can say a couple of things about Baldwin. I think Sarah and I kind of shared our experiences with Baldwin's work on the podcast, and certainly hope that if you haven't had a chance, you'll have a chance to give that a listen at some point. One thing that Sarah did mention that I think is worth noting is the and I don't really know the reason for this, but there is a sort of a strange eclipse of Baldwin's work, which is odd given that he was such an important figure in the civil rights period, and not just in the movement, but also in sort of the broader kind of architecture of the movement. He was invited to speak, as I think I talked about, at the World Council of Churches. He was invited to speak in numerous public forums. He was on numerous television programs, participating in intellectual debates around the issues of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, poverty, etc. And of course, he also would have, been making a major contribution in terms of the arts and letters. So I don't really understand precisely how his work went into the kind of eclipse that it did, but I will say that I think since probably the middle of the last decade, there's been a real resurgence in interest in Baldwin's work, at least in a broader sense. That his work never really went out of fashion, but it was just that not as many people were talking about him or engaging his work. He's a novelist, and really an essayist. I think Sarah, you made this point that he's considered by many to be one of the most important essayists in American literature. And it's true. I mean, for me, at least, my initial exposure to him was through essays and through his short stories. And they have a gripping capacity, He's incisive writer, imaginative writer. Whenever you read anything or hear anything of his, you can hear the music playing in the background. So the tempo of his writing and the feel that you get is I think comes through quite well. He was born in New York. He grew up in the church. I think he had some aspirations possibly to go into ministry. I believe he's this preacher's son. And if you've heard him speak, especially if you watched I Am Not Your Negro, you get that, you can feel the presence that he had as someone with tremendous poise, as well as intellectual power and energy that would have translated quite well in terms of the pulpit, and particularly in the Black church. Of course, he was a queer Black man, so he does talk about having had heterosexual relationships earlier in his life. In fact, one of the things that struck me when I was rewatching I'm Not Your Negro is that he shares experiences that he had with a relationship with a young woman where they would not walk down the street together for fear of what might happen. And he wasn't talking about other Black men and women giving him trouble. He was talking specifically about fear about white people, basically, and probably particularly the police. And so that sort of winds up in If Beale Street Could Talk, that winds up being a dimension of the story. And so I think there's some interesting echoes there. I think I'm not sure what else to talk about in terms of just setting the stage. We can say a couple things. I think what we want to do is talk about If Beale Street Could Talk first. This is a novel of the two movies. This is the fully finished book form, and so it came out. The movie at least came out in 2018, based on a novel published in 1974. Embraced widely. By that point in time, Baldwin was a household name in 1974, so kind of widely embraced and engaged. The story is set in Harlem. I mentioned in the podcast that Beale Street is actually a very famous street in Memphis, but there's an epigraphical. If you saw when you watch the movie, there's a little passage that talks about it being a street in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And I was kind of looking, I was like, was I wrong about this? So I started doing some more research, which is what I typically do when I have a question. And it's very interesting because going back into the 19th century, there is no street in New Orleans named Beale Street. And so there's a lot of different theories about what Baldwin was doing with that comment about it being a street in New Orleans. His father did grow up in New Orleans and wound up immigrating in the 19-teens during the period of the Great Migration. And so those other component factors that he mentions at the beginning are a part of that. I don't really know how to answer the question, but there's two or three different theories. I do think, though, that the Beale Street image is supposed to resonate, and it's supposed to stand in as a sort of symbol for the deep a well of Black life, both its the tragedy and the blues, but also the profound resiliency. And you kind of get that. I think the movie, from my understanding, maybe we don't get quite as much hope as comes through in the novel, but the novel sort of has equal measure in a certain sense of both profound despair and profound hope. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of set that up. I'm open to any kinds of comments. If you want to talk about the aesthetics of the movie, if you want to talk about your experience. I did say on the podcast that one of my hopes was that you would care as you watch the movie. You would wind up caring about the characters, because I think that's one of the things that art, and in particular Baldwin, is provoking from us, is to learn how to care, right, for the stories of others effectively, and in particular the stories of communities of color, which certainly back in Baldwin's day and even up to today have experienced profound oppression, dispossession, and disinheritance. So let me just kind of open up the stage and hear what kinds of comments, feedback, thoughts struck you from If Beale Street Could Talk, and let's see where conversation goes.
Well, I felt pretty strongly about If Beale Street Could Talk, meshing in with I Am Not Your Negro, because in that one he said, I want you to see me. And I actually felt like the whole movie was an exercise in, do you see me? Do you see that we're people just like you? And we have difficult lives. We have difficult family dynamics. We love one another. So do you, like you do, so that was kind of what I got from that movie. There were many points in that movie that I just related to today's current tensions. So.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Vivian. I really appreciate those comments. And I really do think that's one of the things that Baldwin is trying to provoke, right? I mean, because on a certain level, this is just a love story.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing overly unique in that regard. And I think there's a point that he's trying to make.
I just actually bounce off of what Vivian, what you named. I've shared this before, but one of the major areas of discipline inside of ethics is theories of recognition, and people writing on visibility and invisibility and the connection between who is seen and the possibilities of violence or not. And so a lot of that writing and work came about after the Holocaust, after the Shoah, with philosophers and theologians wrestling with basically how could this possibly happen? And one of the things that really struck me this morning was I had shared a quote on my Insta stories from the son of Baldwin, who's highly recommended follow of mine. He's a queer man he published a fiction book that I'm forgetting right now. But he shared a quote from Baldwin from The Fire Next Time, in which he talks about Baldwin names how white people were and are so astounded by the Holocaust in Germany, which is absolutely me as a kid. Like when I first heard about the Holocaust, I couldn't understand. I mean, to this day, how did that happen? And what Baldwin goes on to say is that he says, but I very much doubt whether Black people were astounded, at least in the same way. And he names how that sense of indifference and how like that was part of his experience. And just thinking about, even though I'm aware that there were ways my whole life I haven't been seen, how in so many ways I always was visible and was safe and wasn't seen as threat, and yet what does it mean to not be seen, or to be seen in ways in which one is dehumanized, either because one is seen as violent, one is seen but not seen as a self, as a person, as fully human. And so just you naming that and about what it opens up, like that just really resonated for me as well, Vivian.
Christian, did he actually have like a college degree? Because nothing I've looked up on him shows that. And he was such an erudite person that
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, actually. That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I look things up on Wikipedia and all I see is through high school, and it makes no mention of any college. And in looking at him as a person, he's like a remarkable individual, that he can speak with such authority and you know, confidence and power. I really admired him.
I found it a little hard to read this book because he sort of writes in a stream of consciousness. I mean, the whole thing is like one chapter, you know, and toward the end, especially, I tried to read it at night before I went to bed, and that's not the time to read James Joyce, not James Joyce, James Baldwin, because it was just hard to follow. And he certainly indicts us white people for a lot of stuff and our inhumanity and our inability to see the blacks as people. And it kind of makes you cringe. At least it made me cringe to think that's how we're portrayed. I mean, he really portrayed us rather very negatively, I think. But he has a right to, I guess.
I cringed. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Elaine. I'm sorry.
I cringed in pain when Fonny's family were so cruel to Trisha's family, and then Fonny's father was cruel to his mother, and it was just so painful to watch that scene. And then later, when the white cop is so cruel to Fonny, it really helped me understand how they don't have the option of being angry or lashing out at the white cop or at society or at the system. And it helped me understand how those spurts of anger can come out and affect each other. The other thing about the cops' treatment, but also about the treatment of Dante White this week, as well as Floyd, is the indifference, the incredible indifference and to the humanity of Black people. I don't understand how police practice is so violent and lethal in matters of minor crimes or transgressions, like an air freshener in the car, or the license out of, or the stickers out of date, or whatever, or a $20 fake bill. I mean, I don't understand policing. I don't understand how it gets to that, except if there's a total indifference. I mean, Black lives don't really matter. It just, I don't know. That's my feeling.
Yeah, you mentioned I right away in that scene, that first scene with the cop, right away saw the correlation of Chauvin, because he and George Floyd had tensions before. And so it was like, geez, this is almost a parallel to that. But then you ask the question too, is the policing in some way reflective of the society in which they police? You know, are we responsible for not having recognized it previously? I mean, as it's happened before, and now it's just become an overwhelming thing. I don't know.
You know, I have a question. I feel really kind of stupid about this, but in that scene where, what was the woman's name? I mean, Fonny was the guy. What was his wife?
Tish.
Tish. She was shopping, and that Black guy was trying to hit on her, and Fonny comes in and chases him out, and the white cop comes up, and he is so despicable looking. I mean, he just looks so mean and so cruel. Is he the one did he frame him later? Is he the one that framed him?
Yes.
Okay. It took me a while to put those two things together, but I mean, I saw him look at him and I thought he's going to get him. You know, he just felt that he was going to get him.
Well, one of the things and I think this is important just to note, maybe as a feature of this particular book, I was doing just a little bit of background reading on Baldwin, and one commentator mentioned that this was really the first novel that he writes that is exclusively sort of about a Black relationship from the Black perspective. And it struck me watching the movie the second time that they don't put all the pieces of the conspiracy together.
No.
Like you have to gather them, and through inference and through, yeah, of course that's what happened. And that there's something profound there about that being the Black experience. Like, they don't get to see behind the curtain in the situation that they find themselves in. And remember, this of course is in 1970s New York, so things are a little bit different now. But I think there's something important about that. I mean, one of the things that I thought was so beautiful, honestly, about the movie are the love scenes, because there are so few love scenes purely love scenes between Black actors and actresses that, until recently have shown up, because of all the different kind of strictures we put up. And I'm just talking about the intimacy. I'm not talking about the nudity or any of that stuff. Just the intimacy of those scenes is profound and profoundly beautiful. Like, those scenes to me stack up to any other love scenes that I can remember seeing in cinema, really. And I feel like that's part of to get kind of back to Vivian, your point of like just the sheer humanity of this. It's simply unmistakable. But also, of course, the configuring of, like, you don't get to see behind the curtain. You just know the innuendo, and all the other kind of components, and the frustration of that, right? And the sheer sense of powerlessness, but also resilience.
The juxtaposition of humanity and gentleness and kindness and sweetness in terms of their relationship, and the inhumanity of the treatment is so stark.
And literally, he's literally just a pawn. I'm sorry, Paige, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, kind of, Sarah, tying into what you said about how Black people may have a different perspective of the Holocaust than white people. There was kind of the inverse of that when you see the people showing the most humanity towards Bonnie and Tish being people who probably had their own humanity questioned. It was a Jewish man and a woman who appeared to be an immigrant, or English was probably not her first language. They were the ones to really extend the most grace to the couple.
I think a lot of it for me just reflected how much of like our current justice systems are based off assumptions and bias, like the same as they were when this movie took place. And as someone who didn't do research into the name at all, what I assumed by the beginning little script is basically like, I thought the intention was to kind of take the geography out of the whole story and just say, like, yeah, this story happens here, but this is what our justice system looks like. There's a Beale Street in every city. Like, this is still happening everywhere. There are tons of Black men incarcerated for crimes they didn't commit. Anyways, that's what I took from the name.
I think you're right on. But that was one of the interpretations that I ran into that was a very definite possibility. But Baldwin consciously, mistakenly says, precisely because of what he's trying, the bigger point he's trying to make, which I think fits in with what you're talking about, Joy.
And they made the point very clear that essentially because of lack of money, he made a deal. And so there he now has the tag of criminal on his record for the rest of his life, even though, and that was his compromise in order to hopefully eventually get out and have a life. How much does that happen? A lot.
And actually, that is profoundly requisite to today. I mean, we have a major crisis in the criminal justice system around sentencing. And I was at the end of a 4-year term of service with the National Council of Churches, and we were working on legislation around sentencing reform. And one of the central problems was precisely the fact that people were poor and got into the system for whatever kind of thing. They wound up only having nothing but bad choices, and oftentimes would take a plea deal as opposed to the possibility of going through a trial and maybe facing some sort of harsher reality after that. So it's extraordinarily contemporary at that point.
Oh, Betty, you go ahead.
Well, I was just another thing about the criminal justice system. I think it sheds so many light on so many elements, but I thought it was especially painful to watch them when we talked about the love story and she visited him they got the phone and they put behind bars and they could touch on the class, and even how it just got more painful, I think, as time went by. And the hope they had a lawyer that might help them, and and years went by. And then seeing the child still in prison, and the child looked like he was 5 or 6 years old. Just some of those elements, and especially that behind the jail, talking to each other, was especially moving, I thought.
Christian, you had mentioned something about just now about the criminal justice system and how things have continued over history. Sarah, I don't know if you saw my post in my stories earlier, but this is just tragic that this is starting to move into younger generations, because there was a group of white students from a very large school district in Texas that hosted a slave auction on Snapchat where they sold Black classmates for between $1 and $100.
Between what? How much?
$1 and $100 each. And one even posted, he posted for $1 and said, well, I'd post more if his hair was better, or something like that. It's just sad that we're seeing things like that in younger generations now too.
I don't even know how to respond to that.
Well, yeah.
Where do those people go to church?
Good question.
What's the community that they're in? Good Lord. I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No, you lament out loud away, brother. Yeah, I think so. One of the things this Sunday we already had slated for the sermon series we're doing around kind of some distinctive ministry areas of the church, and next Wednesday or Thursday, whatever day is the 22nd, is Earth Day. And so we're going to focus on creation and the creation care work in our community, and and to just like move forward, like now the trees, that would have, so we filmed today for Alternative, and that would have been, I think, really horrible. But one of the things like we ended up talking about today, both in staff meeting and then in the service, is that sense of how and we're not unique in right talking about this. This is all connected. Like what happens when we lose sight of, like thinking back to the creation story. I just keep coming back there in the last couple of days of like God, like, right, the story of our faith is that God created all of creation. God created humanity in God's image, and then they like got to walk in the garden and they were naked and they weren't ashamed, and they were in right relationship with God and themselves and one another and creation and all the things. And then it goes sideways, and then they kill each other because the one's like, oh, hey brother, like I just can't get over it. It's only chapter 4. And then how God says, and I've just been so sitting with this, God says to Cain after he kills Abel, he says, where's your brother? And then he's like, what am I, my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes, you are. You are your brother's keeper. And so just how this is all connected, because thinking about, I think a lens I often think through is the lens of feminism and being a woman, and how that, like, there are experiences, I don't have experiences of racism against myself. I've been formed to be, in a racist system, but it also helps me to think about, like, I think about Jenny, what you're naming with the high school, and it makes me think about the movie Moxie, which is on Netflix, and I would highly recommend to anyone to watch it. But what happens in Moxie is Moxie starts off within this high school. They have a yearly list they do in which they rate like the biggest slut, the biggest butt. Like they go through and they completely objectify the entire student body, females in the student body. And so how these things are just connected, like what happens where we lose our humanity and we lose the ability to be human towards each other, and how these things are connected, and how grievous they are though. Like so just, yeah, that's it for now.
One of the phrases James Baldwin used was that there was moral apathy and death of the heart, and that's to me what's happening there.
Would you repeat
And
that?
that was also exhibit
Would you repeat
moral
that?
apathy.
Oh, moral apathy.
Moral apathy and death of the heart. And I think we see that in Jenny with the slave inflection. There's also, on January 6th, there were nooses brought. There were, there's all this symbolism that these people are exhibiting, and that those people have children, and children listen and see. And so it is continuing to be fomented out there. But hopefully by now, I feel like we're in a time now where things are seeing the light of day. As painful as they are being put out in the light of day, so that finally, it's like, oh, my blinders are off and I see you, James Baldwin. I see what you're saying. And he referred to himself as a witness, not as a someone who went out there and fought the fight, but who witnessed. And I feel like right now I'm a witness to what's happening.
I think we all are. I think you're absolutely
Mhm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
We are witnesses, whether we're cognizant of it or not. I think that's right.
And I think
But
about
I
how
find it
deeply
really interesting that this has been, and I said this, well, like a year ago in a meeting that we had in one of our leadership summits, and that this has been happening throughout history for a while. We're just becoming more aware of it and cognizant of it because it's becoming more public. Like it became real for us in the Twin Cities because it happened so close to us. It's been happening in the last year in other states and within the Twin Cities. It just became more visible again now with Dante Wright too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's amazing how a lot of this just stays hidden.
Yeah.
It's still amazing how when it is unearthed, like how fast people are to lose that sense of humanity too. I think that's part of what I've been most shocked with over the last couple days. But what Vivian was saying, I'm like, I'm crossing my fingers that those children learn to rebel. But I'll just keep praying, I guess.
What was it? Will Smith said, just recently said that, there isn't more racism, it's just being filmed, and we are a very visual society. And so I have.
One of the things that, I only watched, I'm not your Negro, but one of the things that I've kind of thought about since, watching that and other things that I've read about James Baldwin and Malcolm X and some, or even Ibram Kendi, is I think sometimes to me, I like James Baldwin. I like a lot about what he says. I even like some of what Malcolm X says. But one of the things that does sometimes bother me is the dismissiveness of the importance of making alliances with sympathetic white folk. And that in order to make real change, the civil rights movement, or even now what we're dealing with now, there's a real importance of making alliances with those groups that are going to be sympathetic to the cause. And sometimes, if you like, I think it was somebody, Judith maybe mentioned that sometimes some of this stuff is hard to read because it's so condemning of white people. And yeah, it does explain why a lot of, why Black people have a lot of reason to hate white people. Yeah, I understand that. It's a good part of us, we definitely need to know that. We need to understand the history of African Americans and what's going on. But I always want a little bit of hope here that we can reconcile together and that we can come together. I mean, obviously, the civil rights movement wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't alliances with those people who were white and were involved with having some sort of power. And I think the same is true right now. I mean, you see it, and I think that's one of the most exciting things about what's going on right now is when you see demonstrations, going on now, you see a lot of young white people out there. And, that's really important, I think. And some, I don't know, like the way Baldwin does condemn the Christian church. And yeah, you can condemn a lot of what the Christian church has done in the history of America. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But also, there's also been a lot of good that's come out of the Christian church too. And the Christian church was extremely involved in the civil rights movement as well. Those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I think are worth picking up on there, John. One is, I mean, first of all, is just sort of the visceral, building up the ability to sit with someone's anger and pain. Because I understand what you're talking about. I think I've shared a few times that one of the first theologians I read was James Cone. And he can be just as pointed and sharp as Baldwin. In fact, he interacts with Baldwin, and he wrote a book once called Martin and Malcolm. So he's very much involved in these conversations. So I think sitting with their pain without our checking out, on the one hand, is very important. I think on the other hand, though, another thing that became very helpful for me, at least, was beginning to dissociate whiteness from skin pigmentation. That oftentimes what people really like Baldwin, I don't know that Baldwin and Malcolm were quite there, but Cone picks this up and really develops it, that to be white is to look at the world a certain kind of way. It doesn't primarily have to do, or its most basic essence have to do with skin pigmentation. And so he talks about, because basically racial difference is a construct. Effectively, there's really nothing biological that makes us different in that regard. And so whiteness becomes a way really of talking about power, how power operates or whatnot. So, and for instance, one of the things I love to often point out is that Cohn said that through his experience, Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a black theologian, became a black man, because he began to see the world from the underside. And there's this famous quote of Bonhoeffer's that's published in the Letters and Papers from Prison, where he talks about learning to see history, learning to see the world from the standpoint of the victims. So if we can, and that this is not easy to do, but if we can, I think if you can begin to internalize some of that, that's part of what this white, black, or other, maybe that's too binary. Maybe we want to have other ways or shades of meaning in there. I think that becomes a way, because part of the argument for Cohn is that whiteness cannot be saved, but people can be converted to see the world differently. And so Cohn was very interested in building alliances. I think over time, one of the points that shows up, towards the end of I'm Not Your Negro, is that Baldwin notes that by the end of their life, as they were approaching the ends, Martin and Malcolm had drifted closer together, right? And one of the stories, if I've never read the biography of Malcolm X, probably should, but I've certainly seen the movie with Denzel, and part of the story there is that Malcolm goes to Mecca as part of his breakaway from Nation of Islam, and what he experiences is a multiracial vision. And so on a certain level, like on the deepest level, in terms of your comments, John, I agree. And I think one of the erasures that we sometimes have in our readings of movements or struggles for justice is precisely the erasure of these multiracial alliances. But then we don't want to, I also don't want to discount the need to sit with the rage and the anger. And then at the same time, I also want to kind of bring in those comments I would say about whiteness and blackness, that these things are not essential. Like, they're often treated as if they're essentialized categories. They're really constructs, and they really have to do with how we see the world, how we kind of live our lives in that way, as opposed to just mere skin pigmentation, which gives me a lot of hope, because I'm a white dude. I mean, I'm very white. I mean, and so in that regard, but like, I don't try to see the world from that perspective. I try to see it from this other perspective. Anyway, those are just my thoughts, John. I thought that your comments, I appreciate those. And thanks for letting me.
I think that's the goal, to like be able to really have that level of empathy, to like really feel what maybe the oppressed feels, but like ultimately, while you might be able to like deracialize your thoughts or whatnot, like you're always going to be perceived in the world like as a white man, right? Unless you do something like really dramatic to change that. And so I don't know anything about Cohen. I'll look into him more, but I'm curious about that. I also, John, to your comments, I hear what you're saying, and I guess I just think about like where we put some of that responsibility, because like, yes, the work isn't going to get done if it's only a bunch of Black people that are trying to, fight for equity, because ultimately white people are going to have to give up some of that power and like, bring other people to the table and, make it work. But I think, I guess I think a lot about generationalized trauma and like how difficult it is. I mean, honestly, I think of it in terms of my own perspective, and I know it's not always helpful to equate different types of oppression, but as a woman who's experienced rape and a lot of sexual violence, I get a lot of heat about like, well, you need to involve more men in your process because you're only going to end sexual violence, if men work on it too. And I'm like, I hear you and I get that. And like, I don't have the emotional capacity to be that teacher, like I have to kind of stay in my lane and do what works for me. And so I guess just to your point, John, I agree with you. I think it's great that there's so many people showing up, and I wonder like, what does that look like? How do we continue to show up? How do we like be there with open arms and ready so that when the movement, I don't know what I'm trying to say, something about just, I guess, not putting the more work on the marginalized communities is, I guess, what I'm thinking.
And also, like, who gets the credit for the progress? You know, like if you look at all the work that the Black community has done for their own betterment. I mean, I think there's classic examples of, you know, Thomas Jefferson liberated the slaves. Well, he didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart. He did it for political gain. And so when we think about partnering with people, what are our motivations? Is it really to give up our own power and give them a voice? Or is it really to make, you know, ourselves feel better? I mean, I think we're all guilty of that. And I mean, like what Christian's talking about, how it's not individual white people, it's a system that we're all, you know, indicted by. We have been victimized by it in a completely different way than people who are not white. You know, in the movements against, the movements following George Floyd, and again, what's Dante right? I mean, there's a common refrain that's all cops are bastards. And if you've ever seen ACAB or heard that before, it's not because we think, or I'll speak for myself, it's not because I think every individual police officer is a bad person or is out to kill Black people. It's because the system is really designed to put those people into debt while putting white people ahead. And we're all victims of it in different ways.
I just want to comment again. I don't know if this fits in with what you said, John, but this is, I'm embarrassed to say, this is the first thing I've ever read by James Baldwin. And I was absolutely intrigued with his writing. I don't think I've read an author who expressed himself so well down to his core for a while. But at the very end, I think he's challenging, he is challenging us. And I highlighted this. He says, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now. And he says, even if there's a handful of us, and there are those among us who care about, he said, even if there's a handful, we together create the atmosphere where we can end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. I mean, that is a real challenge. And then he goes on with that ending that just struck me. If we don't do that, he said, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And the reason I bring this up is I was in a conversation with a number of people, friends of mine, who said, Linda, you're just reading all this stuff, but where's the action? You know, what is happening as a result of this? And she was really challenging me. I mean, that's a question. And I think James Baldwin is challenging us because he talks a lot about the white power and a lot about what Americans need to do alongside of the Blacks. So anyway, I thought that was profound.
I mean, one of the things that I've gotten out of reading some of this stuff is that, sometimes the church wants to go outside of the white church to try to be the white savior and to go out and do things that they think that they can do to help the African-American community, and that somehow, is going to make us feel better. We're going to, and there's definitely a need for those types of things. But I've gotten the impression that what would be really helpful is that we cure our own problems and that we discuss amongst ourselves, the fact that, as white people, we are, have a lot of privilege. It's the result of a system that is been in our favor in a lot of ways. And as we go out into the world and see other white people, somehow you got to teach other people of what that means. And you don't need to teach that to African Americans. They already know it. So who doesn't know it? It's the other people in our church. It's people who you deal with at work. There's people who you deal with in your volunteer work, whatever. And those are white people. Is what I'm coming to the conclusion is the problem is clearly not the African American. The problem is the white people.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what he was saying here, but okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
But
I think,
he also said,
go ahead.
he also made it clear that one of the reasons he didn't join, the Black Panthers or the, other groups was because he doesn't believe that all white people are the devil.
Right.
And he recognizes that, that we need to learn to live together, essentially, is what he was saying. So, and a lot of one of the things that saddened me the most was when he made reference to scripture that said he doesn't go to, he started out as a Christian, had a wonderful experience in his younger life, but he left the Christian church because he said, Christians, I'm convinced they haven't heard love one another. And so that's kind of what we need to do. And Joy, part of what you said too, it just struck me so strongly because I remember when we first started this journey of, of this woke process of trying to educate ourselves within the context of colonial, offering these classes and everything. I remember so clearly so many of the Black leaders saying, please don't ask us to take on the burden of educating you.
Yeah.
And so I think that what we're doing right now, that is, we're taking on that process ourselves. And, and then Linda, you're absolutely right. Then where's the action? That's going to be the next step. But I hope that I'm now in such a place that should I witness any of these horrific and unjust behaviors, that I would have the courage to stand up and say something, Whereas before, I don't think I would have, but I feel very strongly that action is also required.
But I do also think that what we're doing, I mean, this is how I responded to my friend, is that what we're doing is we are in the process of educating ourselves. And I thought I knew everything, but I knew nothing until I started reading some of these books and delving into it a little further. I was just thinking of, what's her name? Channing, who wrote I'm Still Here. That was one of her thoughts, is I'm tired of educating you all the time. I just feel like I'm filled with gratitude that we're doing this, because it's opened up my eyes and increased my understanding a great deal.
And it's hard to
Well,
think.
I think you've
might
all
share
touched
that.
on.
Scott, I'm sorry, what?
Go ahead, Judy.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's hard to think then how to share some of the stuff with others. My husband thinks I'm getting on my soapbox because I'm always saying all these things and he's not participating in this, so he doesn't know where I'm going through. But a lot of people are like that, I think, and you don't know how to sound superior. And how do you sound humble as you share some of these ideas? That's what I don't understand. I don't get how to do.
I think you do it on an ad hoc basis and you do the best you can. And then you keep trying again and again. I mean, I was just thinking, John, when you were sharing that, and Linda, when you were sharing, and Vivian, and Judy, I went through this program I don't know, it was about 12 or 13 years ago. And it was called the Anti-Racism Study Dialogue Circle. And these are church-based groups. And we had to read tons of stuff. This is where I first read Baldwin. But one of the things that I remember most towards the very end was we had to read a short, I don't know if it was an essay or if it was like an aphorism, but it was Richard Wright. And basically Richard Wright was basically saying, when white people ask me, how can I help? I tell them, go free your own people. Like, tend to your own house. Like, that's how you can help me. And that is what was part of the animating vision for us, was so that as you're all being pricked, pulled, whatever the stories are, if it's been going on for a long time or if it just started, that eventually we are going to be pulled into action. And so the vision is for us to do no harm, you know, to be the best that we can be and do no harm. So anyway, it encourages me to hear that you guys.
Yeah, I think that's really important, but I also think that it's very important to realize how change can be made by the justice system, legal system, the political action and political organization and social movements, you know, with organization and working, you know, creating groups that work together, and that does make significant change. So operating by yourself isn't, you know, necessary. And I don't think operating by yourself is the answer. You have to be involved in groups, and you have to associate with other groups in order to make that kind of social change. So the political process, the legal system, those are all really important avenues to making real systemic change.
Well,
I agree with that, but I do also think that it's kind of like I look on it as an opportunity thing, where it's the same for me as sharing my own Christian witness. I just don't do that willy-nilly with everybody. I really have to feel the pull that my story might help someone or might reach someone or something like that. So I feel the same way about this. And an example for me is my great nephew, whom I love and adore, absolutely categorically denied that he has any more privilege than anyone else. And so that opened the door for me to have a conversation with him. And so I think in those small ways, we can, you can take that opportunity just as an individual to work on that education of others.
So I know we've been talking, I mean, more broadly, and then we've referenced a little bit of I'm not your Negro. I want us to turn there in a minute. But in doing that turning, I wanted to name just a couple of things for myself. One is that many of you've heard me reference before one of my favorite writers, who when I built the spiritual formation course for United Seminary, her book was one of our central texts, is Audre Lorde, which I know I have at least one Audre Lorde lover in this house looking at Joy. And one of her essays is, I think, a really helpful essay with some in resonance with some of what many of you have been naming, which is it's called Uses of Anger. And the first line of the essay says, the natural response to racism is anger. And then essentially what her article is about is it's a challenge and an invitation, because she's at a conference which is like 98% white women, because it's a literature conference for literature professors, and it's like dominantly a bunch of white women. And she basically says to them, hey, like, go do your own work. Like, figure out why it is that you're so afraid of your own anger and pain that you then come at me whenever I name my own anger. And she ends the essay actually in some resonant way with, Linda, what you were naming at the end of the book we'll read for next time, about that she says basically, and then if you go do your own work, then meet me in the land where we can all be human together. Like, meet me there. And I think thinking of this, us doing this work as a church and as a community of faith, and we've been naming some of these deep, like, theological and Christian themes about bearing witness. What does it mean to be a witness? But thinking about in so many ways, and why it's important to me, why we're reading these books is, and Christian, I think you had named this earlier, and if someone else, if I'm misappropriating, I really apologize. We could go forward and do mission, but if we haven't done our heart work and our inner work, we're going to keep showing up and doing the same patterns. So, right, like, I kept dating abusive men, and I knew that the only way to not marry an abusive man was to go to counseling and have my friends tell me if the guy I was dating was abusive or not, right? And by the way, I ended up with a good one, just, and so I think that's part of it, is thinking even about, like, the ministry of Paul, where Paul has the encounter on the Damascus road, and it wokes him up, right? He gets awakened to a new way of seeing the world, but he doesn't immediately become this missionary who's like, and now I know all of the things, which he still didn't know all the things. If anyone wants to talk about that later, we could have that conversation. But he actually spends time in being mentored. He's tutored. He himself experiences formation. And I think that's so much of, and I'm so grateful to be here with you all, but to say that this work is about the work of conversion. It's about that work of us leaning in and continuing to become transformed. And this will be lifelong journeys, right? Again, to quote scripture, it's not that we'll have attained all of it or suddenly have been made perfect, but we press on to take hold of that for which Christ has taken hold of us, which is to be human in the way that God wants us all to be human. And that's part of what we're naming in this space, is that the problem isn't that God gave us the pigmentation in our skin. The problem is the system of sin that lied to us about what it meant to be human. And so part of that work is to join God's kingdom by then becoming renewed and becoming new humans, to be able to then participate and see the world from God's perspective and from others' perspective. And so just to, like, both affirm and to say, like, let's keep leaning in together to listen and hear God's invitation. And what is that then? Asked to bear witness. And like I had put in here, and then we preach the gospel if necessary with words, to continue to live into what does that mean, to participate and to live into the new humanity. And I think in so many ways, Baldwin, and now that I'm done preaching, so I just decided to join you on the soapbox there, Judy. Let's turn to that text, or to the film, I Am Not Your Negro. Would love to just hear from you, things that, like, resonated, connected, invitations you sensed, things that troubled you, just more specifically for those of you who were able to watch that film.
Oh, Linda, I think you're muted, Linda.
I was just going to mention the man who pulled it together, Raoul Peck. I just thought he did a phenomenal job of inserting. Well, I just thought it was genius how he did it. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit, because to the very end of the book, because there was something that I wrote down that I thought was, sometimes, okay, this is what it said at the very end. He was talking about 2 levels of experiences, and he talked about beautiful Doris Day. I had forgotten how gorgeous she was. And then contrasting that right away with Ray Charles. And then I think somewhere there was, I'm not sure about this, somebody hanging. But after that segment, it was said, not everything that is faced can be changed. Nothing can be changed until it is faced. And isn't that what we're dealing with right now? I mean, everything that's happening around us. Not everything that is faced can be changed. Nothing can be changed until it is faced. I mean, it's like a conundrum right here, or a. So that's all. That struck me about I am not your Negro. Well, so much struck me. It was just incredible.
Thanks for sharing that, Linda. Mm-hmm.
I have to say that for me, I absolutely 100% agree, because after Obama came into office and there was so much, vitriol being thrown at him undeservedly. And then when Trump came in, and so much ugliness seemed to become prevalent, and everyone felt, I mean, a lot of people felt that it was their right to say whatever ugly thing they wanted. And then all of these horrific happenstances came out, and I thought, if nothing else was served in the Trump presidency, and I don't mean to offend anybody, it really, to me, laid the light of day to the ugliness in the underbelly of our society. And I felt like, well, now it's out in the open, and now maybe we can fix it or work toward fixing it. That's my hope and prayer.
Okay.
Thanks, Vivian.
One of the things that, am I muted?
You're on. Go ahead. Thanks, Cheryl.
Vivian, that is an interesting thing to think about, the Trump time and what it might have brought to light. But I appreciated all the scenes in the movie of the white families and the birthday parties and the taking the pictures. And he talked about in these families, these kids are safe and they grow up not worrying about, just choosing a college. That's the hardest thing they have to do, and blah, blah, blah. That was my family. It was profound to look at it from a fact that that's not everybody's. I mean, I guess I knew that, but it just was really presented like when he did some of those things, and then he had the hangings in the background while you're celebrating this thing. This is person in the land of the free over here. That's what they're living. I got it.
I have a relative who always asks, why do the blacks always run when they're stopped by the police and then the police shoot them, But why do they always run? I have no answer for that, except maybe they're afraid. They're scared they're going to be shot. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just like that young, was he Army officer or whatever, that got stopped in a traffic stop, and this police officers, it's screaming at him to get out of the car.
Oh, right.
And he's got both his hands out the window, showing he has no weapons.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm afraid to get out of the car. And what does the cop respond with? You should be afraid. Well, let me just hop right out now.
Right.
And
I know. I think it's because they're afraid. And Anyway, I'm just curious.
Well, that
It's a
situation
trauma
with
response.
that. Pardon me? The situation with the military officer he was really in a tough situation. He had one police officer telling him to get out, and the other one just saying, to have your hands so we can see him. How do you open up the door and undo your seatbelt with your hands out the door, out the window at the same time? If he had taken his hands out of the door and gone after the seatbelt, he might have been shot and killed. And then apparently he did have a gun in his car that was registered, and he had the right to carry that gun. But we would have never heard anything other than the fact that this another, black male was killed. And they put the police officers are, as somebody said earlier, they're so militarized right now, and they're operating from a place of, they're not there to de-escalate the situation. They take a simple traffic stop and turn it into as if it was a murder. And you take a situation where you have a 20-year-old kid who has a air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror, and you end up, even if you were thinking you were going to tase the person, what are you going to tase the person for? $20 bill. Why are you wrestling somebody to the ground for a fake $20 bill? I've had all throughout my life, I was driving through Nebraska and I had to go to the bathroom. I drove for a mile with a police officer following me. And then I got out of the car, gave him my driver's license and said, give me my ticket. I got to go to the bathroom. And I ran away from him. I said, I got to go to the bathroom. If I was a black guy, I would have been shot to death. I mean, it's absolutely freaking ridiculous.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, John.
Well, the policing system was created to catch slaves, right? Isn't that like how this whole system was formed years and years ago? And so I think, again, I'm all about generationalized trauma. I think about it way too much probably, but just thinking about, why do people run? You think about trauma responses and fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Makes sense to run.
Yeah.
Or faint.
One of the things that I found really interesting in the I Am Not Your Negro footage was some of the film about the marches, and where Martin Luther King, and they're standing on the sidewalk, and this cop office, this officer has his billy club and he's jamming it into people to move them back a step or two, and then hearing Martin Luther King say that a nonviolent approach means that you also are accepting the likelihood or possibility of violence being on you, and the kind of strength that it takes to stand and take it versus give it back or run away was really amazing.
I have to say, I'm all for the nonviolent method, though, because the violent method always leads to backlash. And if you're the minority group, I think that's the biggest lesson of one of the biggest lessons of the Bible is you have to go at this situation from a position of love your enemy, and make your enemy realize that what they are is they're doing things that make them exhibit their immorality. And the only way to exhibit somebody's immorality is to take the higher ground and be nonviolent. And so the response, I'm not for, I understand the reaction of looting and destruction of police cars and that, but I think that is a big mistake in that, because it will lead to a reaction and justification for arresting 40 people, and then now 40 people have to go through the criminal justice system because of that situation.
Yeah.
And to play a James Baldwin, the James Baldwin quote here, here's a quote from, he said, "If we were white, our heroes would be your heroes too. Malcolm X would still be alive. When the Israelis or the Poles pick up guns and say, 'Give me liberty' or 'Give me death,' the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, he is judged as a criminal and treated like one. Everything is done to make an example of this bad N-word so there won't be any more like him." And so I'm my own position aside, just that sense of, I think one of the things I've wrestled with is thinking about how my own history as a US citizen is deeply shaped by a bunch of looters who threw tea over in Boston Harbor and then decided to shoot a lot of people and just to say, like, you know what, and I think, I mean, Hamilton has been something that's resonated more recently. Like, I think just even that as a place of like, oh, here's, on one hand, here's what it means to be a hero. And we see that where there's that deep sense of connection, like even my own family, where my brother-in-law and father-in-law, between them, own like probably 60 guns because of a concern that they're going to need to defend America. And so just like how to wrestle with that and how to lean into continuing to have that conversation. Again, I'm actually personally, I'm much more on the same wavelength of what you're naming in terms of how I actually want to show up in the world, and yet also like being able to name that, like who gets to claim the legacy of even the founding of our own country, like, and then who can behave in view of that when people are literally give me liberty or give me death, and I will die for it. And what happens to make someone feel that level of desperation, and that level of anger and rage and pain. And I don't know, like, that's not my, like, I don't like, but if we lived in Handmaid's Tale, you better believe that I'm going to be plotting some stuff. Like, you know, like, just so you know, there can be a record of this if that ever happens, and Lord willing it doesn't, you know. So I think that's one of the things, like, I want to keep wrestling with is just like, what is it like to feel that way? That you literally, no one's going to listen to you. There's no hope. There's no possibility. There's no out. What options do you think you have then? And how do you choose to respond?
Yeah.
Makes me sad.
Sarah, are you struggling with the question of whether or not there is a point in time where violence is necessary?
Oh yeah, I actually think that it is. It just makes like, even, I mean, right, Bonhoeffer was wrestling with this, and so like during the time of Hitler, you know, is like, at what point is actually violence a necessary part for the possibility of future liberation? And I think, like, yes, if we lived in the Handmaid's Tale, I'm pretty sure if my life were constrained in that way, that I would be organizing for things. And so, like, just naming, like, I'm more right now just trying to name that is not at all my experience. And I still believe in the possibilities of justice and movement through nonviolence. And yet if I look at the history of my own country, and if I lived in a dystopia related to me as a female, I could imagine a world in which I would feel differently, and I would respond differently, even though I can't imagine myself, or I want to be like, don't do it. Like, this is just, this is so, what are we doing? This is so bad. But then I'm like, I don't know. Like, you know, I still believe, like, I grew up believing that the police are all my friends. Like, I know that if I get pulled over, I can just cry if I want to, and it'll be fine. And I don't get pulled over because they can run my plate, and they're like, oh, like, you know, like, I don't have any warrants, but my mom did. You know, but again, when she got stopped, like, my mom's a white lady who's, you know, anyway.
Well, that going down that violence route is a slippery slope. I'm not sure I can buy into that. I mean, I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced one of those situations that's, you know, one of the probably most rare situations in history where you have, you know, total totalitarian you know, society, and you're, you know, he's you know, accused of being a spy and all this kind of thing, and so he's maybe involved in the assassination plot of Hitler. But I don't know.
It is interesting question, because as you were talking, because I think this is one of those places that actually intersects with maybe on the other side of the coin or the underside the anger that that we encounter in the writings. And as you were talking, Sarah, I was thinking about the complicated legacy of John Brown, right? Who leads who attempts to incite a revolt at Harper's Ferry, and that he inscribes himself essentially into the history of the nation. Like he understands himself to some extent as acting out of, the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. But he was so problematic because here's a white dude, right, trying to incite a slave revolt. But I think one of the other things, like, and I basically am a practical pacifist, like you, I think, Sarah. But I've done a lot of reading on sort of the Black radical tradition, and one of the elements of that are the various Maroon movements in Jamaica, the Caribbean, as well as some of the slave revolts that happened in the United States. And if you actually analyze the violence, almost always the violence on the side of the masters is like profoundly disproportionate, as opposed to the people who rise up seeking to get freedom. They certainly do oftentimes do things that we would have to say are violent, including killing people. But the responses are typically, so there's something there. And I mean, I just put that out as, I think, because this is a question that's part of this story. This is not just a theoretical question about violence or nonviolence. This is a question, I think, that helps then for us to understand, like, the writing and the looting and the anger. Even if we would say, I don't want to see any rioting or looting, I do feel that way. At the same time, though, trying to sit with the level of anger that would be required and not just write off people who might be involved in it. Some people, obviously, some of those folks are opportunists, but there are others who are just like desperate, and desperation can drive you to do profound things.
I think there's a big difference between, violence in response to aggression yourself. So, I mean, you have a right to defend yourself. And I think as a Christian, you have a right to defend yourself. You can protect you and you can protect your family and that. I think the Black Panthers were kind of misrepresented in history as well, because, that's what they were all about. They were all about, self-defense and protecting their own community from the police brutality. And yeah, they were armed, but it was a self-defense motive. It wasn't to create armed revolution or armed rebellion or anything like that. Slavery, yeah, that's the same thing as Nazi Germany. But I think we're at I hope we're at a different period of time than that.
Oh yeah, I just mentioned Brown because he becomes an interesting figure to think with in regards to some of these questions, and the dynamics that are like, because I think, like, if we were talking about people who like participated in, violent, I don't know, looting or whatever, some of those people may feel like they're trying to defend themselves as well. If they live in a situation where they're constantly constrained and enclosed by the system, by the interactions that they have with people, you could begin to understand. I'm not trying to justify it or anything, but
I just think you really got to look at that, because you really should think that through, from my opinion, because how can you condemn the January 6th people and then at the same time, condone the looters? I mean,
I'm not trying to condone anybody.
No.
I'm just saying that I do think there's a difference, actually.
And and what is the call to empathy in all situations, to say what is going on for a person, whatever their decisions they're making, and that's part of the, not then, because to understand doesn't mean that I have to say, oh, like, two things ethically, right? It doesn't mean I have to agree, but I can seek to empathize, to understand Like what is operative for my father-in-law that he owns that many guns? He is terrified. Do I think it's justified personally? No, I don't. But which is part of what you're saying is you're saying I don't think that that's justified, but I can understand where my father-in-law is coming from. So that first move of what is empathy, and then also what happens. A really great book of philosophy is about the virtues. It's called Burdened Virtues, and it's about what happens when we live in a world that is unjust and is fallen, and how sometimes like that wrestling, the ethical, moral decision making is really hard and really fraught. And that's part of what we're doing here, right? Is wrestling with that, but really seeking to lean in and to listen, and then to continue to order our own lives and interiors, and then we'll keep wrestling and dialoguing about that and stuff. So I appreciate that. I appreciate everyone. I appreciate you sharing, John, and everyone sharing and just leaning in to wrestle about this stuff, because it's the real world, and it's hard and complicated. And so just recognizing we're at 8:06. So Christian, I think you had a just brief close to bring us home for tonight. But just know that we are praying for you all and with you all and for the city, and for just grateful for y'all wanting to lean in and continue to wrestle with what is Christ and following Christ ask of and from us in the midst of living in our time. So Christian.
Yeah, I just want to, just a couple of things. One is, being in prayer and trying to discern how can we be present? How can we show up in regards to Dante Wright and his family, and the fact that there's a 2-year-old who doesn't have a father, and there's a community that's been wounded yet again. I think that's really important for our community. I think that's really important for us each as individuals, and I just ask that you are thinking about that. I want you to know that we on the staff are trying to explore ways to materially engage in that regard. So that is going on, and that's one of the reasons that I ask for your prayers for us. And also, there's a famous phrase that, well, I guess it's not, I don't know if it's famous, but it's a central phrase of two of my theological heroes, called waiting and hastening, or the hastening that waits. And it's an attempt to grasp hold of this idea that we really do have to call on God to act. Like, we really do have to lean into prayer, but we also have to act in the light of what we believe God is calling us to do, the world that we believe God wants. And I know for myself, I have oftentimes leaned not in the prayer direction, but actually more in the acting direction. And what I've found is that I'm like out of gas. And so I think finding ways to I don't know if I want to use the word self-care, but I do want to use the word finding ways to allow the spiritual energy in your life to be refilled, because we are supposed to pour ourselves out. And so I hope and pray that you are finding you have ways to do that are healthy for you and that help you to make a difference in the lives of people who are around you. And I want to just encourage that. I hope that this was a place that enabled you to bring some of that forward, to bring that lament, to bring the frustration, but also to connect with other folks, and to talk about things that matter. We do have to do a certain amount of waiting, as much as we want to do the hastening too. Those two things go together. The second thing is just to remind you that our next meeting, we will be reading Baldwin's The Fire next time. I know some of you already have read this, so you'll have a chance to maybe reread and we can discuss in a little bit more depth. But that will be our last Faith and Justice for the spring, and then we'll take off during the summer, and we'll come back together in the fall. And Sarah and I are kind of working on some possible ideas, and we may have some news for you in May. We'll see in terms of what all that stuff looks like. But let me say a quick word as we go forth. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you that you are the living God, and that that no one is dead in your presence. That though people pass from this life, and that is such deep pain, nevertheless they live because they live with you. And we pray especially right now for the Wright family, Dante's mother, his girlfriend, his 2-year-old child, the community around them, for the deep pain and anguish of a life ended far too soon. For the I can't, Lord, imagine the sense of tragedy that overshadows that community, including the police. And but we want justice, Lord. We want peace. We want shalom. We cry out for that. For those who have long had it denied to them, but also to the rest of us, so that we might know real wholeness and real humanity. And so we pray, Lord, that you will be with us, that you will be in the midst of this wreckage and catastrophe, that you will bring healing, that you will bring comfort, and that you will bring a taste of your Spirit who overcomes death. We ask and pray all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.